Chapter 5, Restoration Africa Style. When I deployed to the Horn of Africa, I was a full-blown cycling junkie. I prepared myself for the 6-month deployment by praying that God would make it all right if I couldn't ride a bike during this time. I probably did more time in the saddle those 6 months than I ever have. I spent most of the time on the unfinished portion of the camp, a place I called the Back 40. When I wasn't riding the 40 on one of the Recreation Center Trek mountain bikes, I was spinning in the camp gym. The Djiboutians ran the rec center and would let me have my choice of bikes because I would do maintenance on them occasionally on the weekends. Simple stuff like changing flats, scrubbing and lubing chains, and general upkeep. The 40 was flat and dusty and filled with acacia trees. The trees had thorns on them that could be a few inches long and could give you a bad case of flat tires. The only wildlife were some crows and some very scruffy-looking rabbits. Temps would soar after noon, and I would occasionally hit one of the few ice water coolers parked around the perimeter of the camp for breaks. The iPod was loaded with Foo Fighters, Primus, and Van Halen. I loved weekends because I would ride, hit the base pole, get some protein drink at the Green Bean Coffee House, and go again. I also liked to walk the perimeter from time to time at night. There was a tall dirt barricade with a trail in the center. I would listen to music and think about home. Even though at this point all I had was anywhere. I didn't even have an apartment waiting for me when I did get back. The cycling routine would not stagnate, however. I did get an invitation to suffer while I was there. Ivan Falcon was a chaplain's assistant in the Army Reserve. My pastor back in Ohio was also a chaplain's assistant, which is basically a part-time bodyguard in the Army National Guard. Pastor Barry was a year or two older than me, had been to Iraq, and was suffering with cancer. Ivan Falcon was from Riverside, California, worked for Jensen Bicycles, and had a mother with diabetes. Ivan explained to me that he did a century ride every year to benefit the Diabetes Foundation. He vowed that this year would be no different, so he invited me to suffer along with him. Originally, he had several troops interested in doing the 100-mile trek in the Grand Barra Desert. The Grand Barra is flat and has a cracked surface. It reminds me of the pictures I had seen of the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. I had always been interested in race cars and hot rods growing up, and they were always doing these high-speed tests at the Salt Flats. When the day finally arrived, it would just be me and Ivan. Everyone else dropped out. We were provided an Army medic to look after us in a chase vehicle. Camp Lemonnier, along with members of the French military, ran a half marathon in the Barra annually. Our adventure would prove to be just as difficult, even though it was perfectly flat. Ivan would be riding his own personal Jensen single-speed mountain bike that the company had shipped over for him. I would be riding an exotic German-built machine that I had spotted at the base headquarters weeks prior. Turns out Ivan knew this Navy guy that owned this incredible bike, and he not only agreed to let me use it for the event, but borrow it whenever I wanted. What a stand-up dude. As it turns, I would need this machine to serve as more than a luxury. It would be a necessity in the heat, dust, and wind. Ivan would find that his single speed was a poor choice, as he suffered with not having the options of gearing up and down. We drove out to the desert at night, sleeping in the trucks. I laid in the bed of my truck staring at the scene from a telescope. The sky was filled with thousands of stars. The day would start at 4 a.m. to stay out of the heat as long as possible. The only light would be the chase vehicle behind us. There was a row of rocks placed for several miles. I assumed it marked a foot race course. This would mean that we would be turning around and going the opposite direction many, many times. It was depressing riding in the dark. I didn't mind riding in the heat, just was not happy with the dark. It wouldn't be long until the orange glow on the distant mountains would bring the sun. Me and Ivan had our conversations early. Being several years younger than me and being from Southern California, Ivan had a West Coast personality that I had only experienced from a former friend I knew on active duty, a surfer dude from Los Angeles. Falcon was into vintage race cars and had a SoCal sense of humor. I was into photography and had an Eastern, Midwest, strictly business, blue-collar Pittsburgh personality. When dawn broke, we took turns on the front, just staring at the line of stones. When the stones stopped, we would turn around and go back. We did this back and forth all day long. The first few hours were easy enough, each of us taking turns on the front. After the heat and the wind and dirt settled in, that's when the suffering began. Anybody who has put in some time on a bike knows about headwinds and tailwinds. The headwind is like climbing stairs, really pushing it. Tailwinds is like God pushing you on the butt, making you feel like Superman. Normally, I never get saddle sore. If I were a pro and trained for 6 to 8 hours, sure. However, when I was training for my little amateur contest back home, I was only out for a couple hours at a time. I definitely got sore this day. The longest contest I have ever participated in was the Dirty Dozen bike climb in Pittsburgh, which I participated in just 2 months prior to leaving for Africa. The organizer, Danny Chu, also known as the Million Mile Man, Dan wanted to be the first man to ride 1,000,000 miles on a bicycle in his lifetime. He started the contest with his brother and some friends back in the early 80s. The event is a tour of Pittsburgh's toughest, steepest climbs covering over 50 miles of riding. In 2011, there were 13 climbs, hence the Dirty Dozen. The challenge takes an entire day to complete. The field of riders is 300 plus and comprises every type of bike rider and skill level. Mountain bikes, everyday road cyclists, city commuter bikes, and of course hardcore racers. Canton Avenue takes a particularly long time as it is a 37% incline but only 630 feet long. However, it is brick and can be very slippery in bad weather. On Canton, you can pull too hard and fall over due to the lack of speed or slip your back tire and go over. Some riders need a few attempts or just give up completely. I was determined to do the climb the first time as I was afraid to break something if I fell. The strategy worked. Although I suffered a bit in the dozen, I would not experience the saddle sores that the Grand Barrow would give to me. It became an endless shifting around on the seat to get comfortable with the occasional get out of the saddle altogether time. Ivan was suffering more, though, as I started to put gaps between us. Even when I was going as slow as deliberately possible, he was in agony. The only distraction during this time, after all the small talk ended, was when a local goat herder brought his flock across our trail of suffering. The man just stared at the obvious Americans and their nothing better to do project of riding in the sun, heat, and dirty wind. When the misery finally ended and we met our 100-mile goal, a Navy chaplain had arrived to congratulate us and take some snaps. The medic had taken some shots with my Fuji camera over the course of the day, which was brilliant on his part. I did a story on our military website, and an entire event was worth the suffering. Ivan would not mount a bike for a couple of weeks. I would be back on the 40 within a couple of days. I eventually coaxed Ivan into some laps on the 40 when he finally recovered. I think he was impressed with the effort and suffering that I could endure. It was another trying ride for him. All of this would serve a purpose from God. It would spark something in me that I would spend the rest of my time in Africa thinking about. I needed to go back to New Hampshire. I watched videos as much as I could on YouTube when I was in the PA office, thinking and plotting my next attempt.